Pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Actually, I thought it would be more fun to surprise Dan with a guest introducer. Can you really surprise Dan? But my choice had a conflict tonight and instead sent along these words. See if you can guess who it is. Dan Gross is a Westport icon whom we, his neighbors, should value with the same respect and affection that we do other community treasures, such as the library. He speaks tonight about his book, Better, Stronger, Faster, The Myth of American Decline and the Rise of the New Economy. Dan's new book captures the societal change all of us feel, but few have been able to synthesize and evaluate with his insights and precision. Dan is one of our nation's most perceptive writers, and his observations about the reasons auto-sharing and rented textbooks are more and more commonplace captures a phenomenon that has eluded many economists and journalists. He tells his story with the charm of a novelist and whose facts lead to an unchallengeable conclusion. This was written by Westporter and former SEC Chair Arthur Levitt, someone who is more than qualified to render this opinion. What I know is that Dan writes just as eloquently and insightfully about the public library. He sits on the library board and penned the following words for our strategic plan. The library is open to all ideas and points of view. Historically, those who house, lend, and care for books have been at the forefront of defending and promoting free expression. Today, the library serves as a hub for community discussion and debate, an incubator for ideas, a place where anyone can pursue an interest in practically any topic. Indeed, I can only agree with Arthur Levitt on the caliber of Dan's writing. Dan Gross began his own public library experiences in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then on to Cornell and Harvard for a master's in American history. He began his career at the New York Times, then went on to Stern Business, Slate, Newsweek, and now at Yahoo Finance. The author of 6 books, he has been hosted on almost every media outlet you can think of, and we are very proud that much of his writing was done right here at the Westport Library. And speaking of media outlets, tonight's talk is being recorded and will be available within a week on the library website, westportlibrary.org, and iTunes under the Westport Public Library with all of our events. Following tonight's talk and some Q&A, Dan will be autographing his books. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dan Gross.
Everybody, can you hear me without a microphone?
No.
So Arthur Levitt couldn't be here. He had to help Goldman Sachs restore the reputation. I'll be back next year. He's sort of saw because I wrote a chapter in a book about him about 13 years ago that portrayed him in a positive light. So I did that very strategically, knowing that one day would have to call upon his, I seem to call upon his good graces. Okay. All right, I will try to be relatively brief because I believe there's a new American Idol tonight. And I don't want to keep you all in my So, a few years ago, and this is, I spent time on college campuses. Nobody reads the New York Times or listens to National Public Radio, but when I tell them I was on the Colbert Report, it's something that college students and even my children get. And as I tell people, it's a picture here, and one of these guys is a blowhard who thinks he's very funny and is a big know-it-all, and the other guy is Stephen Colbert. Thank you very much. So I was promoting my last book when I was on the Colbert Show, which was about the financial crisis. And as I said before, did a brief book on what went wrong, and have spent the last few years trying to get a handle on some things that might have gone right. And so this is the new book. I first started thinking about this a few years ago when I was in China. Has anybody here been to China? So this is a city called Chongqing. It was the capital during the Second World War. And they put up this tower to memorialize that fact. It's about 250, 300 feet tall. And until about 25 years ago, it was the tallest structure in the whole city. And now, of course, it is sort of dwarfed by these office towers and hotels that just march on forever. And embedded in the top of the tower is an ad for Rolex, which shows you how much this communist country has changed. And when you go to China, it's just one thing after another like this. Cities that you've never heard of, where there are millions of people, there's so much building. You come back, you ride the magnetic train that goes to the airport at 250 miles an hour. You can stand up in the aisle, and then you come back home, and you ride Metro North, which goes at the same speed it does in the 1930s, in cars that date to the 1950s. And when you see what they're doing there, it's hard not to think that this is the economic future and we're the economic past. When Europeans came to the US in the 19th century and they saw our cities, which were gritty and industrial, building skyscrapers, and people who just wanted it more, they felt that they were being eclipsed by the US. That's what we feel like when we go to China. And this whole phenomenon of the tiger mom, right? That this Yale University professor wrote this book about how, Chinese people, they don't let their kids play or have sleepovers, they just work all the time. That's the future, we're the past. And I call this the mustache of doom theory, which is after Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, goes over to China and says, look, they have all these solar panels and these trains, infrastructure, and we don't do anything. And they're the future, we're the past, we're in decline. A couple months after I went to China, I went to Japan. And there, it's totally different. 25 years ago, we thought about Japan the way we now think about China. In Michael Crichton's novel, The Rising Sun, they were buying Pebble Beach Golf Course. Japanese companies were buying Rockefeller Center as if they were going to take it back to Tokyo with them. Their car companies had a better industrial policy. They had better technology. Japan was the wave of the future. And when you go there today, it's the land of the setting sun. This is a country where the population has started to decline, where they haven't had much growth in 15, 20 years. We visited a city where they make the Toyota Prius, Toyota City, and we saw actually where the robot puts the Obama sticker right on the bumper in the factory. And we talked to people and said, look at your demographics, what's your future going to be like? And the guy said, maybe the robots will take care of us in the future. It's a country that has lost the will to live, to procreate. When you see a child, remember there's that movie, it was Child of Man or Children of Man with Clive Owen, was this future where no one could have a baby anymore, and they were all excited when someone was about to have a child. That's what Tokyo is like. When you see an infant, it's this very rare sight. And people look to Japan and say, they never really got back up from their huge credit bubble. If we don't act, they had this lost decade. This is our future. This is what we could be. And I call this the beard of doom theory. Because Paul Krugman is the New York Times columnist, Nobel Prize winning economist, close personal friend of mine. This is what he's been going on about. If we don't do what I say, this is going to be our fate. They're not the only ones. In 2009, when the world was falling apart, and the US in particular, it seemed like we were in another depression. We were shedding jobs, 700,000 a month. We didn't quite have bread lines, but there were investment bankers who didn't get their bonuses that year. I mean, it was very, very bad. And, so all sorts of people thought America was finished. You had it from historians. The guy on the left, Neil Ferguson, teaches at Harvard, is a Brit, and he sees this in the context of what happened to the UK. And he said, it's not 1,000 years that separates your top from your bottom. It's a short ride, and we are on that road. It came from people who looked to the future. The guy at the bottom, Nouriel Roubini, also known as Dr. Doom, who is the hardest partying economist I know. He predicted the housing boom, and he said, we're still going to have all these problems, and I know about the future, and we're in big trouble. It came from the political right. The guy up there with the glasses is Michael Boskin. He was the Stanford economist who was the chief advisor to the first President Bush. There's a group of people who think that whenever a Democrat gets into office, things are going downhill. And he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, March 6, 2009. The Dow was at 6,600. He said, Obama's radicalism is killing the Dow. So until we have a different president, nothing can go right. We're in decline. And then it came from the left. Joseph Stiglitz Columbia University economist, Nobel Prize winner, who said, you know, we're not being tough enough on the banks, we're not doing enough to stimulate the economy, because we're not listening to me and doing what I say, we're in trouble. And they sure seemed right. This was a scene in Greenwich in early 2010. You know, things were quite bad. We lost many trillions of dollars of wealth. We were losing jobs. The only thing rising was vegetable seed sales. But amid this cacophony, you think back to 2009, all these very prominent people, well-known people saying that we were finished. There was a small voice that came out and said, maybe everything isn't so bad. And that was me. I did a cover story in Newsweek in March of '09, which was precisely the market bottom, saying maybe this is a good time to invest, maybe it's a good time to start spending. Did one a few months later saying the recession is over because the forecasters that I trusted the most were saying that growth had started again, and this was held up by President Obama at a town hall meeting and ridiculed. And then things started to get a little better, and so the next spring I did another one saying America is back. And of course, 3 weeks later, Newsweek was put up for sale and sold for $1 to a 90-year-old man. And in history, the number of enterprises that were sold for $1 to a 90-year-old man that went on to great things is relatively small. So why do I think this? I'm not an optimist by nature. I grew up in Michigan in the 70s and 80s when the auto industry was not doing so well. I lived through and reported through the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. But a lot of what I saw, especially what I saw in the last few years, led me to believe there is a case to be made for some optimism. And a great part of my job was that I got to get out of this whole New York, Washington, axis of misery. I've been to 20 or 30 states, 15 or 20 countries, and I know there was a great burden to my family for leaving, but I came back with some really good pictures and some good stories and some good material. And I think, if you look at the data, generally the March of '09 was the bottom. It was not another beginning of a new Great Depression or another leg down. And I think, I will spend the next maybe 15 minutes trying to convince you to see it my way. And if I can't convince you, at least maybe you'll buy a book and help me avert decline. So there are basically 5 reasons that I think the U.S. is not in terminal decline. One, whenever there is a consensus about something, whether it's housing will always rise and it will never fall, whether it's tech stocks are the place to be, or Dow 36,000, people tend to be wrong. The second is, before I went to grad school, before I became a journalist, I went to grad school and I studied history, and these moments we had in 2009 were a lot like things we've experienced in the past. We think of the U.S. and that we rose from these colonies, from nothing to this great superpower, as if it was this uninterrupted rise. And things have always been going bad economically here. The first colony in Jamestown, 90% of the people died after the first year. Had a higher mortality rate than a lot of dot-com companies in the late 90s. In the 19th century, we didn't have a banking system to speak of, so we would have a banking panic, and then we would have a recession for 4 years. We had to get money from the Europeans to build our railroads. In the 20s, people went to Italy and said, this Mussolini guy, he's really got it figured out. And Sputnik went up. We said, we're going to lose our technological lead to the Russians. 70s, we had high inflation and Nixon, all sorts of bad things. And in 1992, Paul Tsongas was a senator who was running for Congress and for president, and he said, the Cold War is over, and Japan and Germany won. So there's always been this pessimism coexisting with this optimism throughout history. And in those moments, in general, in the past, the pessimists were wrong. There was a time when the banks were terrible and they were resisting reform, when people thought the president was un-American, that he had a funny name, when there was a lot of hate-filled speech on the radio and the airwaves. And basically that's what was happening in 1933. The same type of rhetoric, the same type of reaction that you saw in 2009, we saw in 1933. The real reason the third reason, everybody else is worse. If we're going to decline and be surpassed by somebody else, someone else is going to have to do better. And when you look around the world, whether it's Greece or the UK, where they are putting themselves back into a recession, The people who are supposed to challenge us and overtake the US have generally done quite poorly. A few years ago, a journalist named T.R. Reid wrote a book called The United States of Europe, how they were going to be the next superpower because they have the united monetary policy, united trade policy. They're going to be the next leaders. In 2006, 2007, Mayor Bloomberg called a press conference. He ordered up a report from McKinsey saying, we're going to lose our financial lead to London because they have better regulation. They have smarter people. That hasn't quite turned out. And again, all these people who think China is going to overtake us look at Shanghai. This is a picture I took. We went to a village last November. There are about 20 people living there. They live on $15 a month. They just got electricity 2 years ago. Their cable system only has 30 channels, compared with our 400. And there are 400 million people in China who live like this. So forget about the lack of freedom, the pollution, etc. It's a very poor country. The real reason, I'm going to say that. So the consensus is wrong. We've been here before. Everybody else stinks. The real reason is that the US, I think, has both the internal capacity to rebuild itself and the ability to engage with the world. And again, this is a slide that always does really badly on college campuses. Shows my age. People remember the $6 Million Man. I know I'm on better footing with this crowd. It started as a TV movie in 1973. And the premise was this guy, this astronaut, had suffered this catastrophic fall. And could he get back up? And there's the voiceover that said, we have the technology. We can rebuild him. He will be the bionic man. He will be better, stronger, and faster. And as you look around, I think there's evidence to show that we have these capabilities. So what do I mean? Very quickly, that's different. That's an 80s show. So the first is faster. When we were in Japan, we met with the deputy governor of the central bank, and he showed us a chart. He said, all these stuff that we did responding to our crisis, you did the same thing. Stimulus, nationalizing the banks, quantitative easing, all this complicated stuff. But you did in 16 months what we did in 12 years. So the speed of the policy response, whether you think it was useful or not, happened very quickly. And that was matched by a speed in banks took the bailout, they generally paid them back very quickly. Another key point was the return of pragmatism. Alan Greenspan, who I had the privilege to interview, I spent 2 hours with him a few years ago, and he's every bit as electrifying in person as he is on television. It was a 6-shot of espresso interview. He was an ideologue. He thought you didn't have to regulate. He had this very rigid worldview. And Bernanke is much more like MacGyver. Remember MacGyver? This guy was the ultimate pragmatist. He would take whatever was at hand, whatever needed to be done, and figure out a way out of the problem. And that's sort of what happened in 2008, 2009. So we had a faster policy response, but it was really the private sector that reacted with the greatest speed. There's all this talk in Japan about how they never foreclosed on anybody, how they had these zombie companies. In the US, we restructured very quickly. So we had these bailouts, but a lot of companies went bankrupt. We foreclosed on a lot of houses. And a lot of companies did kind of radical things to survive. I'll just use a couple of examples. The Hancock Tower, actually a guy who used to live in Westport became a real estate magnate, was buying portfolios of properties by the several billion at a time, gets behind on his debt, foreclosed upon, tenants leave, within 3 months, new owner, new tenants, it's sold about 12 months later, restoring a lot of value. CIT Group, very big lender, goes into bankruptcy 5 weeks later, $10 billion in debt gone, new CEO, new funding model, publicly held company. The best example is Ford. We talk about GM and Chrysler, they all went bankrupt, had to get bailouts. Ford took out this massive loan in 2006, and when car sales fell 40%, they fought their way through it. They cut costs, they became more efficient, they got some labor concessions. The stock fell to $1.50 in 2009. I believe by 2011 it was up to 18. They recently got their investment grade rating back, they're paying a dividend again. They did that without having to go bankrupt. And you look across the economy, companies' holdings of cash, their profits now at record levels, and almost every metric about corporate failure is down. So we had very quick restructuring. One of the things that enables us to do this is efficiency, which is a discipline that Americans invented. Think about Walmart's supply chain, total quality management, Henry Ford, and the Model T plan. One of the, we all got the memos about using both sides of the paper and saving paper clips. That's the sort of boring efficiency. What's really powerful is when you can make a business out of it. This is one of my favorite companies I discovered that basically saw their sales double every year during this recession. They make solar-powered trash compactors and they manufacture them in the US. So basically, public garbage can, you put coffee cups, whatever in there, it's almost all air. When the volume rises, it hits a beam and it compacts it down. It's powered by a battery that's charged by the solar panel. And when it's ready to be emptied, it sends out a text message. So instead of needing to be emptied every day, maybe once a week. And what's happened is that cash-strapped cities like Philadelphia and Chicago have bought these by the hundreds and thousands, deploy them as a network, save a huge amount of money. They're based in Boston. It's made in the USA. So it's going to, they export. They've now signed up with Waste Management. This is a small market, but it's indicative to me of how you can create a business that helps people save money and be more efficient, and that's very powerful. That is the world's largest buffalo statue, and it's the only thing of note in Jamestown, North Dakota. In fact, I think it's the entire population of Jamestown, North Dakota. One of the other internal resources, so efficiency and figure out new ways of doing things, that was an internal resource. But we also had real internal resources. And the recovery was not led by the coasts. It was led by the heartland, the real America, the blue states, the places where nobody lives. There we have, in North Dakota today, there's an oil boom because they just figured out a new way to get at the oil that was already there through fracking. They drill down, they drill across, they use water and chemicals to liberate the oil. So North Dakota's oil production has quadrupled in the last 5 years. A similar thing has happened with natural gas. We are now a huge producer of this. This is changing the way we generate electricity, the way we make things in this country. And so these were these internal resources that existed. We didn't think of ourselves as a big oil or natural gas producer. And we figured out a way to tap into them pretty quickly. One of the big things that makes people very upset about the future is this idea that everyone around the world is growing more rapidly. Brazil is growing 8%, India growing 9%, China growing 10%. And we're chugging along at 2%. And it makes us feel diminished. And that's one of the big reasons people feel we're in decline. But if you look at it from a slightly different angle, there are many ways in which global growth is not a zero-sum game. I think there are a lot of myths about the US and its role in the economy. The first is, as Yogi Berra said, it's so crowded there, no one goes there anymore. We have the sense, you talk to any American CEO and they want to tell you about, I'm investing in India, I'm in the Persian Gulf, this is my foreign strategy. When you meet foreign CEOs, they are just as likely to tell you about their US strategy. The US is the #1 recipient of foreign direct investment. It's people buying factories, building factories, buying condos. So, Fiat taking over Chrysler. I interviewed the CEO of Uniqlo, which is a Japanese retailer, and I think it's Japanese for character is we've cornered the market on cashmere. You go to the store on Fifth Avenue, it's 3 levels of sweaters, shirts, etc. The most expensive lease in New York history, they paid $300 million to be there for 15 years. And when you talk to this guy, he says, this is the world's biggest market. We want to be the world's biggest retailer. Of course we're going to be here. They had a store in Soho that was one of their biggest sellers. And now they want to open 200. I went to rural Virginia, where I saw a Colombian, not Columbia University, but Columbia, South America company, plastics company that built a new factory. They make the pods for coffee cups and for yogurt, investing $35 million to employ 400 people in a place that was really starved for jobs. Why? They wanted to be near their customers. And of course, real estate. We have made an enormous amount of very bad real estate decisions in this country, and it's what's holding us back. But the foreigners are bailing us out. When the Aaron Spelling mansion went for sale for $150 million in LA, it had multiple gift wrapping rooms, because if you're going to have one gift wrapping room, you definitely need 3 or 4. It was bought by a British heiress to the Formula One fortune. When Sandy Weil, the CEO of Citigroup, put his condo on the market in 1 Central Park West, the only question was which Russian oligarch was going to buy it. And it was, I can't really pronounce his name, but he paid $88 million and he bought it for his 22-year-old daughter, who's a student at NYU. So as long as don't get any ideas. So this is happening all over the country. This idea, everybody wants to be somewhere else. In fact, everybody wants to be here. The second, and so just a few other examples. Burger King was sold to a Brazilian private equity firm. When the New York Times ran into trouble, they raised money from a Mexican industrialist. And you can think about the worst possible professional sports franchise in the United States. It would have to be the New Jersey Nets. Long record of futility. They're in New Jersey. Those 2 strikes are 3 strikes against them. And when the guy who owned them got into trouble, he of course sold it to a Russian oligarch for $200 million. People like to pay for the things that we have here. Another way they pay is through exports. People say, we don't make anything anymore. And every month when the trade numbers come out, I say, yeah, we don't make anything except for the $186 billion of stuff that we exported last month. The U.S. is the #1 exporter in the world, about $2.1 trillion last year. Exports have grown 30%. So when people around the world get more money, they buy the stuff that we make. We're the Saudi Arabia of food, which by that I don't mean we make women at the Whole Foods walk around covered in head to toe. We just make more grain and food and pork and beef and chicken than anywhere else. Agriculture is a $140 billion export industry. We've gone from being this energy hog to a country that now exports coal and natural gas. Remember a few years ago when they were going to build that platform in the middle of Long Island Sound to import liquefied natural gas, and it was stopped. Now investors are building terminals so we can export natural gas because we're making so much of it. I found a small company outside Philadelphia that makes high-end wallpaper. 2007, 80% of their sales were in the U.S. Their main distributor went bankrupt. Today they're getting 70, 80% of their sales from overseas, mostly through just going to trade shows and using the internet. And this is it was really hammered home to me how much we make and how easy it is to sell stuff overseas. I was in Vietnam several years ago, and we were at a secondary school, and we didn't really have much to talk to these 14-year-old kids about. And so we're trying to engage them, and they say, what do you like to do? I said, we like to listen to music. Oh, who? And they all said, Hannah Montana. And my first thought was, good God, haven't we done enough to these people in the last 50 years? Haven't they suffered enough from American exports? My second thought was, here's a country of 87 million people, and they are eager to produce this junky content that we produce. So just think what else we could do. That's a chart of exports. The response, of course, is, well, that's great if you manufacture grain or if you're Miley Cyrus, but we're a service economy, and it's harder to export services. But we actually export an awful lot of services. In 2010, I gave the commencement address at Lake Forest College, which is outside Chicago, and of course, this being May, it was outside, and it was snowing. So I had to sit up there in these metal seats while 600 kids each got their diploma. And it was, of course, amazing how many of them had names that did not seem like they were necessarily American citizens. I was talking to the president, who spends his spring break in China every year. 15% of their freshman class comes from overseas. These are people who pay $45,000 a year, full freight tuition. That's an export. Think about tourism. People you see with funny accents at the Gap or in Midtown Manhattan, those are exports. And 63 million people came to the U.S. from overseas in 2011, another record. When people get rich, they want to come here and have the poor, they want to go to the Olive Garden. God knows why, but they want to go to the Olive Garden. They want to go to Disney. And you go to Hawaii today, the 2 big markets are Japan and the west coast of the U.S., which are doing poorly, but they now have direct flights to China, and the people who come from China spend more every day than any other visitors. We had the CEO of Saks on our show the other day. The flagship store on Fifth Avenue gets 12% of its sales from Westport, and 15% of its sales from foreign tourists. Okay, so we can bring a lot of people here, but there's 6.6 billion people overseas. And we can't have them all come here as tourists. And so one of the things that companies are doing is something that I call imports, which is you make some product locally for a local taste. So Coke now they just announced they had their 13th product that sells over $1 billion a year. It's a drink called Pulpy, and it's like Orangina. And it was developed in Asia. It's available in Africa, Kazakhstan, etc. It's not even sold in the US. There's a very, the typical company in the S&P 500 gets about 47% of its sales overseas. And companies are just doing a lot of business selling stuff to customers where they are. This movie, The Avengers, opened. It did, I think, $150 million at the box office its first weekend, which was great. But it opened abroad 2 weeks before and had already done $450 million. There are a lot of companies and markets for whom the US is now something of a rump or minority market. And we're out there. So, if you go to Turkey where they invented the coffee house, you will see 90 Starbucks. If you go to China, that's a factory in Shanghai where GM makes Buicks. Buick is a prestige item in China. If you are picked up at the airport, it will be in a Buick Regal or a Buick LaCrosse. Apparently the last emperor from the movie owned a Buick, so they all think it's a luxury good over there. And of course, KFC is they have several thousand outlets. Here in the U.S., they're basically being shut down. Overseas, China, they are growing very rapidly, and for the sake of journalistic inquiry, I have visited one in Beijing, and it's really, I just had one bite. So we're out there in the world selling a lot of stuff to people where they are. It doesn't do a whole lot of good for workers or employees, but it does a lot of good for the investors. It does a lot of good for owners. And for a lot of these very big companies which haven't funded their pensions, or which owe money to the government, or which owe money for health care benefits, the only way they're going to be able to pay them is if they do well in these overseas markets, because the US is not going to grow 10% for GM anymore. But we're doing pretty well over there as well. Final example of how the world's growth is benefiting us is a phenomenon that's still in its infancy, but I call onshoring, reshoring, insourcing, which is everybody thinks all these jobs are going overseas. Call centers in India, manufacturing in China. Well, in China, wages are growing 15% a year, and their currency is appreciating. It's gone up about 25% in the last few years, which means everything coming out of China is more expensive. There's a lot of corruption there. If you have a factory, the local government may show up and say, you know what, we want to build a hotel here. Shipping costs are very high. And so for certain companies, it starts to make sense to think about manufacturing in the US again. There's a company called Rawlings, which makes baseball mitts and cleats and bats. And one of their products is the mic and bat, $200 softball bat. They used to make them in China. They brought production back to the US. And the CEO said, I have to consider all my costs. It's a $200 product, so I'm tying up all this money in inventory. It takes 8 weeks to get a new one out of China. My selling season is 6 weeks. The sporting goods store runs out. I'm done for the season. So this is a very small phenomenon, but Boston Consulting Group has written a report. They think up to 3 million jobs could come back in the next 10 to 15 years. Sometimes we onshore the entrepreneur, and then we onshore the manufacturing. Chesapeake Bay Candles, started by a Chinese couple. They came to study at the University of Maryland. She came to study journalism and eventually thought better of it, which is advice I give to all journalism students that I meet. And they started a candle company. They manufactured in China and Vietnam. And they realized they're sending the supplies, the paraffin and everything else to Asia, and then sending it back. And they make a pumpkin spice candle for the Hallmark store. And the Halloween selling season is 3 weeks. And it takes 8 weeks to get something out of it. So they built a factory adjacent to their headquarters and now manufacture in the US. This is a small trend, but it's something that happens. And we shouldn't just think that any trend we already see, say jobs going overseas, is just going to continue forever. The last reason I'm optimistic is that we still have shown a capacity to create systems that become very large and allow other people to create businesses, like the telegraph, the railroad in the 19th century. Most years I go to the World Economic Forum in Davos. I don't think I'm in that picture. Aside from terrifying myself on the ski hill, you sit around and you listen to people talk about how America is finished every year. Turkey, they're really good. Next year it's the sovereign wealth funds. So these guys from the Persian Gulf, they've got it figured out. And pretty much anybody who's up one year is not there the next year. So last year when I was at Davos, you go to various lunches and dinners, and everybody is hanging on every word that Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, is saying. They're looking for Mark Zuckerberg, and at the Shabbat dinner, everyone gets very excited because Randy Zuckerberg gets up and sings, which is, if you want to talk about American decline, that's it right there. After that dinner, everybody goes to the Google party. And that's like the hot ticket to get into. And once you're inside, everybody is entranced. And it's not because of something they're smoking or drinking, it's because they're looking at their iPhones. And so you think about those three companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, probably combined worth about $800 billion today. They represent the US the way IBM and Chevrolet and McDonald's once did. They're global brands, they export, they attract human capital. 10 years ago, combined value of, 5 or 6 billion. Apple was an also-ran PC company, was trading for close to the value of the cash on its books. Mark Zuckerberg was, I think, 17. And Google was a company, it was a piece of code, but it was not yet public, nobody had any inkling. So if you can create these sort of things overnight, you hit a very big domestic market, you hit a very big national market, you can create a lot of wealth and you can create a lot of jobs. Now, one of the raps on these companies, combined Google, Facebook, Apple, they employ 100,000 people, which isn't that much. But it kind of misses the point. The value of the railroads was not in the jobs that people had putting down the railroad ties. It was that people could build companies like Montgomery Ward that could ship goods anywhere, or that you could have national brands because you could ship your product anywhere. The value of the internet was not the people who had jobs laying down the fiber optic cable, it's what everybody else did with it. And those companies, especially Apple, has created an environment where other businesses can do things in a new way. Think of what they've done for publishing, for software, for music, for entertainment. A lot of jobs indirectly created. Google basically changes the way that we all search for information and the way that everyone does their marketing. Facebook, I'm still not sure what the added value is other than providing a new venue for teenagers to misspell words on purpose. If anybody can figure that out, let me know. But when you think about the ability to create these things, that's a final thing that should give us optimism. Now, this is the thing where someone like Art Cohen would stand up and say, yes, but what about this? And I call these people the yes buts. Because they say, we have a terrible unemployment crisis, housing, we're going to have huge tax increases, politics are a mess, China's imploding, we could have a fear of recession, and is this as good as it gets? And the answer is, well, it's possible, but there's much more that we can gain. The economy has been creating jobs, the private sector in particular. We can always make better choices about our fiscal policy, about monetary policy. And I think consumers have not really caught on to what companies have. When you think about it, companies, they wrote off debt very quickly, they figured out a smarter way to do things, and consumers are much slower on the uptake. We still spend, $25 billion a year on bottled water. If you can imagine if we stopped putting water in bottles in Fiji and shipping them here, and instead spent that money paying our debt or keeping current on a mortgage, we would be much better off. People think that we're in decline because all the things that we needed to make our life good, houses, cars, you can only get by borrowing a lot of money, and now credit isn't available, so what are we going to do? And the answer is much more renting. We've had businesses that have risen up, not just for the renting of houses, but a company like Zipcar, which lets people get mobility without buying a car. Check.com, which is a textbook rental company, so instead of paying $150 for your kid to have a textbook that they're never going to read and sell at the end of the year for $20, They rent it online for $50. Rent the Runway is another one of these recession-era businesses started by 2 Harvard Business School students. It's like Netflix for fashion. You can rent a dress, a formal dress for $50, accessories, etc. Has 1 million customers. So if consumers tap into those same impulses, we can get, I think, significantly further along. So I would say I'm still cautiously optimistic. There are people you can talk to who will say that housing has ceased to be a drag. If you look at our GDP reports, it's actually adding to economic growth. We've built so few homes that if we just have a little population growth and a little job growth, there will soon be a housing shortage, so realtors take note. We continue to create jobs, although not at a satisfying pace. And on the fiscal side, if Congress just fails to agree, there is a lot of these tax cuts will expire, a lot of spending cuts will go in automatically, so that even the deficit can start to become a little under control. And again, I think I'm optimistic because I focus more on the private sector than the public sector. So many of my colleagues who write about politics can't even bring themselves to show up to my book party, let alone read a book like this, because they are so focused every day on our banking system and housing and our political system, which is dysfunctional. Those are things that we can all decide to make better choices about. It's not that we're incapable of doing better. It's that we've chosen the last several years not to do better. And the people who warn about decline think there are these vast structural forces that mean that we can never get back up. I think that many of these forces are actually working in our favor. Now, a good magazine article, I was told, always circles around to a kicker and tells you, brings you back to the beginning. So when I was in China, I went to the Mary Kay sales office in Shanghai. They had a very inauspicious start in China because in China, when somebody knocks on your door, they usually think you're there to take them away to a labor camp, not to sell them a cleanser and face cream. But they changed their business model, and today you go, it's just like what you see in the US. They have the pink cars and the posters of the people who've done a lot of sales, and it now does 25% of their total sales. I went to a Walmart in a rural city called Guangzhou. I went to a factory where GM is making Buicks. I met the publisher who had bought the Chinese rights to my last book. I ate at a KFC. I went to the KFC. I looked at it. I didn't really eat at it. And when you take the totality of that, it's possible to think that, a lot of people think that you go to the economic future, or you look at the economic future, which is China and Asia and all these places, and you think that the world is leaving us behind. But another way to look at it is that the world is taking us with us, and we all have to figure out how to go along. And with that, I release you for American Idol. Oh, yes, sir.
Oh, what a refreshing thing. I'm surprised that when Newsweek went down, that Roger Ailes didn't call you up to go to Fox News, and I thought it was a joke, because I guess the climate is so negative on Obamacare and all that, and you did somewhat reflect on the fact that most of the conversation is about the political aspects. And I wonder if you could address, why is it that stuff like Fox News it does make our downfall, so get rid of Obama, and why that is the conversation when something like this comes up?
I don't think it's anything new. Going back 200 years, when the other guy was in power, the other side thinks, this is how can we prosper when someone who does not represent our values or believe what we believe is in charge. We had a civil war in this country. We had vast regional differences. We had the things that people said about Roosevelt. It's very similar to what is being said about today. A lot of people couldn't abide Nixon being president, and we survived him being president for 6 years. So I just think that politics, there's this politicization of the economy that is sort of overdone. A lot of people instinctively think, the other guy's in power, my life is going to suck, and therefore everything else stinks. And I think that's a lot of what we see today. And that those sorts of things and that type of rhetoric is done for, I don't think it's done for ratings, but people have a certain worldview and they like to talk about it. I've done plenty of shows where I get up and I'll give my whole thing and they'll say, yeah, but the Fed is printing money and we're going to have inflation. People have a particular worldview. They don't want to see something that clashes with it too much. So I think the political system generates all this heat, and if you look out there, I think a lot of people are just sort of, some people pay attention, but a lot of people are getting on with their lives and figuring how to do things a little better. Yes?
So, who are the heroes? Is Ben Bernanke one of your heroes? Like, who do you think really got it right and put us on the road to recovery?
I really think there were almost no heroes, because the guys who did the right thing at the time of crisis were also the people who set the table for the disaster. So Bernanke in 2002 and 2003 was saying, oh, it's okay to keep interest rates low because there's this savings glut around the world, and we're just doing a favor by issuing all this mortgage debt so they can buy it. Someone like Tim Geithner, who was very good in the crisis, was also sitting at the New York Fed before all this stuff blew up. And it's a lot of the same people. And the one supposedly great banker is Jamie Dimon, and he's not so great. So I think many of the people who kind of came to the fore and steered their companies through this were also people who helped create the conditions in which the firemen set the house on fire, basically. So very few heroes.
Since you gave me props before. As you travel around the United States, what was your sense of the education system, which has always been talking about growth of America is always based on very sound education and a goal, focus on math and science. And often those people that are coming here, perhaps people from overseas, are actually shipped right back out because we have an immigration policy that does not welcome them to stay. So did you get anything as you went around that there was some innovation in education or some kind of rebirth that, because one thing you can say is that help you improve it. I mean, corporate America's been phenomenal. No doubt about it. Extremely efficient, manufacturing group, but wages are not growing. And high-paying jobs are harder and harder to come by. So you see that in young kids that get out of school having a hard time. So what did you see around the country in terms of reform in education and some type of change so that we can sort of reassert our prominence in math, science, and what's important?
Well, I think our prominence in math science is still there, and we have this sort of upside-down system where the higher education and our graduate programs are the best in the world, bar none. Outside the U.S., they don't have great graduate programs in a lot of disciplines. Then our undergraduate education is also pretty fantastic, especially compared to other places. And then you get down to the primary system, which has vast regional and even citywide differences. I mean, public schools in Westport are not bad. Is Michael Gordon still here, or you so I think it's the fact that our higher education.
So we're not a dumber nation.
What?
So we haven't become a dumber nation.
Dumber than what? Than we were like in the 50s? I don't think so. I mean, there's kind of cultural literacy questions.
Outside of Westport, of course.
But there are a lot of public schools that fail. And I think in the 50s where there's as many public schools, well, in the 50s there were a lot of people who didn't get a public education because there were parts of this country where it just wasn't available to people. And our community colleges, people are getting post-secondary education that would have never gotten it in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s. So I think some of those comparisons are unfair. And on the question about wages, I think it has less to do with education and the fact that companies they don't want to give it up. They'd rather have 50 basis points more profit than pay people 50 basis points more in salaries. And they can get away with it.
Yeah. So when you go to Davos and these other meetings, they say, oh, next year is going to be Turkey's big year, and the year after that, you're at the Gulf. I mean, does everybody get up at these meetings and say, I'm sick of hearing of this stuff? Or because everything I read is the same thing. Like, you read The Economist, they say, oh, this part of the world is going to be up and coming. thing this year. I mean, at some point, more people like you sit back and say, well, I mean, obviously you're writing this book, but are they tired? I bet you this.
No, I think everyone's always looking for the new thing, and there's so much poverty out there in the rest of the world. So many people whose living standards are not anywhere near what we would consider to be acceptable or desirable, that people are constantly looking at, this is going to be the next place, right? I mean, everybody in the world already has a cell phone, except for the 50 million people in rural Nigeria, because they've already saturated urban Nigeria, right? So people have to look for growth somewhere, because a lot of products and services, they need a new frontier. I think that's why there's always this sort of search to promote something else as the next big place. When you have a very mature market, it's hard to get excited about it. Joel?
I appreciate your optimism, but what do you do about the disparity in wealth? And how does that act as a drag on the CEOs who are doing extremely well? If you do go out to your former home, Michigan, or Indiana, Ohio, places like that, there's a lot of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not.
And what does that disparity in wealth do? Because it's increasing, or it appears to be increasing.
There are a bunch of things. My friend Tim Noah has wrote a book called The Great Convergence, and if we were here, I could just turn it over to him. But he's got a whole set of things that start, a range of proposals. Some of it has to do with education, some of it has to do with taxation, some of it has to do with, empowering workers to organize. There are 10 different things you can talk about. I think clearly it's unavoidable that taxes on the higher end are going to go up, because for Congress, if they don't agree on anything by the end of this year, some of that's going to happen. I don't know if that does a whole lot for but the best solution to it is sustained growth. I mean, the reason that wages are low is because we have a lot of slack in the labor market. If we had 3% growth for 3 years, wages would finally start to come up. And if we have a better safety net for healthcare, training, et cetera, better public investments, I think if that doesn't reverse it, at least it helps kind of mitigate some of the issues surrounding it. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about what your metrics of success would
My
be.
personal ones?
No, to support. For example, you would immediately think perhaps U.S. share of world GDP either stays the same or increases or something like that.
Well,
but I wanted to lead to what are the leading indicators that you would point to that would point to the
Well, part of the reason that people say we're in trouble is because our share of global GDP is declining. I think that's an absurd statement, because we're 4% of humanity and we do 30% of global consumption. That's crazy. We should welcome the fact that maybe we'll be 25% or 20%, because that means that everybody else's living standards are coming up and then they can buy what we have to offer. When I talk about metrics of failure declining, I'm talking about basically bank failures. We had 300 banks with gazillions of dollars of assets failing, and this year I think it's 22 so far. Come way down. It's credit card delinquency rates. It's people keeping up with mortgages. It's corporate bond defaults, bankruptcy filings. The absence of failure begets failure. We have a very cyclical economy. When things go bad, people tend to fire more people, and it creates more failure. And success begets success. And so I think the absence of those sort of traditional metrics of failure, the decline of them, is something that should give encouragement to everybody else. And when you think about, there's always this mystery is, why are car sales rising? Why are retail sales rising? Because people are in a much better situation in the aggregate than they were 4 or 5 years ago, because they're not falling down on their face financially to the same degree they were earlier in their life. And success tends to beget success. So those are the sort of things that I think are